Oh, okay. Hello, BDO family, and thank you so much for joining us for today's very important conversation. My name is Jay Curtis, Executive Editor of BlackDoctor.org, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. We're so glad you were able to join us for part 3 of our ongoing series on the FDA's Diversity Action Plan. Today, we'll take a deep dive into the new draft guideline aimed at increasing minority participation in clinical trials. This initiative holds great significance for our community, and we'll explore what it means to us, how you, our audience, can contribute to the conversation, and why Black participation in clinical trials is so crucial. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists, Dr. Tanya Smalls, Senior Vice President and Head of Medical Affairs at Bristol Myers Squibb. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Of course, of course. Ivory Allison, National Senior Director of Community Impact at the American Liver Foundation. How are you, Ivory?
Pretty well. Thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to this engaging conversation.
Absolutely. Dr. Remu Bihure, medical oncologist at Hematology Oncology of Indiana.
Thank you so much. I'm ready to talk about this. This is a very interesting topic.
Absolutely. Yes, it is. So let us dive right on in. Oh, and we have Leslie. Leslie, how are you? Leslie Henderson Williams, Director of Global Diversity and Inclusion for Clinical Trials at IQVIA.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm a last minute straggler, but I appreciate the invite and participating today. Thank you.
No worries, you're always welcome. You're always welcome. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. For those of you who don't know, for this FDA draft guidelines, there has been an opening, there has been a commentary has been opened up for the draft guidelines. Excuse me, has been opened up until tomorrow, September 25th. So far, we have about 32 comments so far. So I want to open up to the panel and ask, how do you guys feel like we're doing with the commentary? Should we expect more? How can we encourage our audience to leave more comments? Who are the comments for? So feel free, anyone, to chime in and share your thoughts.
I'll jump in.
Sure.
I think the comments are meant for the public and also meant potentially to change this draft guidance to the ultimate rule that comes out of it to create a better document. But the question, though, is how far does this go? The way I see this guidance is that this is a first step in the right direction. And the reason why I say that is that the guidance which comes out of the Fedora Act requires that diversity action plans should be presented to the FDA prior to any major clinical trial. But the question is, so what? What happens if people do not meet the intended um, document that was presented?
Mm-hmm.
Is this just another paperwork that's going to be pushed to the FDA, and people will say, "Well, we wrote a guidance. We wrote a plan. We didn't meet our goals. We're sorry," and people move on, or are people's feet going to be held to the fire? And
Mm-hmm.
how are we going to do that?
I love that. Thank you. So I'm going to rewind just a little bit. And Leslie, I'm going to go ahead and ask you, what is your perspective on the FDA draft guidance on clinical trial diversity, and how does it differ from previous mandates? I think you're on mute.
There I go. Sorry, I couldn't get off mute. Oh, it's the end of
Yeah,
the
no
day.
worries.
Yeah, I mean, I think the guidance, it's wonderful. I think that we do have a platform and a guidance to follow. I think one of the challenges that I find in particular is that the guidance seems to, it's clear in many ways, but there's also some areas when we talk about, ex-US strategy, for example, and the involvement of PK/PD data that wasn't in the previous versions. So I think that there's a lot that's it's a wonderful opportunity for us to respond, but there seems to be quite a bit of still some murky areas to me. For example, in terms of strategy for ex-US, because the guidance is primarily, focusing on the burden and underrepresentation of people in the United States, there's a huge plethora in our audience for what does that look like for ex-US. And I feel like the guidance still needs to have maybe a little bit more clarity around that. But it'll be interesting to hear from others. I do think that it's more and more sponsors are becoming well-versed in the guidance and implementing FDA diversity action plans, which is a good thing. But I do still think that there needs to be a little more clarity just around ex-US strategy in particular. So.
Can you break down what ex-US strategy is for those who don't know? I know for us it's general terminology or regular terminology, but for those who don't know, what is that?
Yeah, so when I talk about ex-US strategy, what I'm really talking about is what does diversity look like outside of the United States, right? Mm-hmm. Because the guidance, speaks to how we are looking to implement strategies and information that's unique to understanding what we should do in the United States, what measures and tactics we need to employ to ensure that we're achieving, those people that are using the medications who are affected and burdened by the disease. So I think when I say ex-US, what I'm referring to are outside of the United States. Where does the expansion of populations in terms of mentioning, I think the shift in the emphasis for us is it mentions use of ex-US populations to supplement goals and expectations on global trials. When we're calculating achievement of U.S. representation, from a highly ex-U.S. sample from other homogeneous countries. So I think it just, when we talk about ex-U.S., we need to better understand how data is captured in countries besides the United States and how we can assess that data. Some countries, for example, don't even release race and ethnicity data. France is one. Some countries also, it's the origin of birth. It's not even where you live. So it's a larger mountain to climb for ex-US, but particularly just understanding what it looks like in terms of ex-populations to maybe supplement our goals and expectations on global trials.
Absolutely. Tanya.
Hi, Jade. I wanted to just mention one of the things that I think is a good step, and is that the FDA is showing that they find that this is important, that adding diversity to clinical trials is important. And I agree with the doctor where he mentioned, what happens when they don't follow the guidelines, or what are the repercussions, if you say, and maybe there's an opportunity to provide incentives or encourage these organizations who are focusing on clinical trials to make sure that they are incorporating and focusing on diversity within the clinical trials if they're putting this out there. Because I agree, if it's just an action plan, a document that's out there and it's like, great, we did it, we put it out there, so we focused on diversity, we did it, and then nothing else happens, and we're here again in 3-4 years and we're saying, whatever happened to that mandate that was put out there? There has not been an increase in diversity with clinical trials. Nothing has been done. So I do agree, we need to make sure with the action plan that there is a with the guidelines, that there are stipulations and that there maybe are incentives, and something that is just not a document that was created just to say, I checked the box for us to have diversity.
Mm-hmm. If I follow up with you on that, this is what I think. So if you read that FDORA Act, which the FDA has to use, the FDORA Act does not empower the FDA to do anything. And I don't think our current political environment would allow for the FDA to be given that kind of power. So that's not going to happen. But if the thing is, what can we then do as consumers of drugs? What can we do as persons who will want diversity. I think we can take a diversity action plan and begin to sort of publish that information. In other words, if a product A require or at least had a diversity action plan that stated A, B, C, and D, this is what we'll do. We should be able to create a clearinghouse, if you will, where you can compare the plan versus the results and encourage consumers to go and look at that kind of data. Because the truth is that what will change the marketplace is consumer behavior. When consumers begin to ask questions, when people like us begin to ask questions and say, this was your plan, these were your results, they don't jive and they don't represent the patients that we prescribe drugs for, I think that would change behavior. But if we expect that this is going to be legislation, it ain't going to happen.
I'll guess I'll give an additional perspective. I think number one, the diversity action plan is brilliant, and it's brilliant for so many reasons. Number one, this whole, as you know, this whole movement of equitable healthcare and clinical trial diversity, or what I like to call inclusive research, has really taken off. And just really within the recent years, many of us have been fighting for this for decades. But the support, the funding, and I guess the bigger interest has really started to take off. The challenge, the thing that I fear the most, is it takes off and then it goes back down, and the incentive and the excitement starts to fade, and then what happens? So by putting this, at least pushing this forward, you make sure that people are constantly thinking about it. I think the challenge is, no matter how many protocols you write, no matter how many diversity plans you have, if we don't have buy-in beyond the people who write the study, but those that enroll in the study, the patients that need to go on the study, they're still going to fall short. And as you know, as being a hemonker, for example, you know the criticality of getting trials quickly run, drugs quickly approved, because patients can't wait. And you end up running this challenge of, how do I make sure these patients that are diverse come on the clinical trial and at the same time move it faster? This mandates that you push to make sure you do have the right population. On the other end, what's the repercussion? There are many times you'll see a product get approved, but then now companies may have to do a post-marketing commitment or requirement to make sure that they're expanding their patient population. So I do think this heightens the awareness, pushes companies and institutions to ensure that they are thinking about it. I think the next step is for us to hold hands as an entire healthcare ecosystem to make sure that these patients are truly coming on the trial. I know a lot of the discussions today are going to be about that, but I do think it's going to be mandatory that all of us hold hands to make sure this happens.
Absolutely. And we're crossing our fingers that it does, and it's properly executed. And so once that does happen, Tanya, I'll pass this one off to you. How will this change the future of clinical trials? Why is this significant?
Sure. So, I mean, if you think about clinical trials, what's the whole purpose of clinical trials? We have innovative technology medicines that we need to make sure are safe and effective so that they can get approved and used and continue to move healthcare forward, treat diseases that we couldn't treat before. And if you look over the last, decade, innovation has skyrocketed. But the problem is not for all. So this, if you think about, again, if the trial's job is to make sure it's effective and safe, and actually we can actually move the needle in healthcare, what happens when not everyone who truly have the disease are actually representing on the trial? When you don't have patients that truly represent the disease, and you have a subset of patients, your trial, you're decreasing the generalizability of the trial, meaning that when you're running these trials, the data may not be applicable to all those that have the disease, because you're only looking at a subset. You're only getting data from a subset. The other thing is, when you look at safety and effective and efficacy, we know that factors like race, like ethnicity, age, gender affect drug response. So a group of patients that may respond in an efficacious way the drug may be efficacious for one group of patients, may not be for others. Their drug response may be different. The way they metabolize the drug may be different. So it may not be applicable for everyone. So we're not really understanding why this drug may not work for this particular subset of patients. It may be because they weren't really represented on clinical trial. If you look again at just in terms of data, again, since we have two hemonkers on the call, you look at, again, breast cancer, you see that women of African descent tend to have twice the mortality rate for certain types of breast cancer. When you look at prostate cancer, you know that Black men have twice the mortality rate. When you look at endometrial cancer, Black women have twice the mortality rate. Why is that? And even if they're treated, they still have an increased risk of death. Multiple myeloma, the same thing goes on. And a lot of it is where they really studied in the clinical trials, are we using the right and effective dose and the right treatments for their disease? The only way we know is if they're truly represented on the trial. And then not to mention innovative medicines, just access to innovative medicines. So why is it important? It's to make sure we understand the full population of the disease, to make sure the people of color, people of lower socioeconomic status, make sure based on gender, we make sure we really understand your disease and are developing the right medicines for you. We talk about personalized medicine. The only way we can personalize your medicine is if we understand the differences in diseases and you're on the trial for us to really create the right drugs for you. And that is why, to me, it's so critical. So we can kill those horrible stats and really normalize and equalize the playing field.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Ivory, when looking at the data, sometimes we realize that a big part of the reason why African Americans, the Black community do not sign up for clinical trials is because they don't know. They don't have the education. They just aren't familiar with what it is and, what actually happens during a clinical trial. So how can organizations ensure that the public is well informed and engaged in clinical trials?
That's a great question. Education and awareness is vital, is key. If we're not educating people about one, like Dr. Tania said, about what exactly clinical trials are. At times we have been educating people about joining clinical trials. We'll say, join clinical trials, join us, participate, and the numbers don't go anywhere. Because people, the major elephant in the room when we talk about clinical trials is that for Black people, we know some of us, we don't know all, but we know the history of it. When we start thinking about Tuskegee and people they don't trust doctors. That's one of the areas where Black people don't trust doctors. So now, not only am I going to doctors, you want me now to participate in something, and they're like, oh, no. And so I think that's one step, is educating them about the history of clinical trials and where we are now for where we need to go forward to, before we can even take that step of educating them about participating in clinical trials, because that is the crucial area. And I think that's something that many people aren't talking about, is that gap. Where so many people focuses on the trying to engage people to join these clinical trials, while people don't trust. So we're not trying to educate them. Like, you're trying to push something where they're just like, they're not listening. And so something that the American Liver Foundation has done over the last year is really try to educate people about what clinical trials are. We have even created a one-pager that's on our website that really talks about explaining what clinical trials are, the different phases of clinical trials, what participation involves. We even talk about the benefits and the risk, because many people don't talk about that, and they're not highlighting that for many people. And so that is something that is just absolutely crucial to be able to do. And I think another area that is something that, because of this program, I want to now do in 2025, hopefully we can get this going, is to educate providers. Many providers are medical professionals. If we talk about the assistants and the nurses, they don't know about clinical trials as well. And so how can they educate patients about clinical trials when they don't know? They're not even mentioning clinical trials to them. One, maybe because they don't think that this particular community, Black community, are interested in participating in clinical trials. Or two, they aren't even aware about everything that clinical trials is all about. And so I think there's so many different levels to the education and awareness for that that is so key.
Yeah, can I even just jump in with that, because I think what you're saying is so important. And I know when you told us the story, what your organization is doing in terms of education, to me, that is so critical, because you can imagine when someone is just diagnosed at that point with a horrible illness, at that point, they got to try to figure it all out. Like, okay, I'm going to jump on a clinical trial. I don't know what this is. You get offered all this information and you have to digest it, knowing the historical challenges that happen. Let's talk about the historical atrocities that really happen. And you sometimes don't know how to separate today what's happening in clinical trials, because you've been scarred by our history and the truth about our history and what happens in those trials. So I think learning now really the benefits of clinical trials today and what it can bring to the future of these diseases is going to be important. Understand a lot of times with clinical trial, you may get standard of care. You're still a lot of times getting treatment, and or you're getting the treatment plus another drug. So, right, understanding those pieces, understand the ethical code that now surrounds clinical trials. And so I think making sure people understand that and understand what's available to them is going to be really important. And I think you also touched on the other piece that to me is so critical. Our own biases as clinicians and people in the healthcare field, right? There was some data that came out, I believe at ASCO, maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, women with breast cancer. And they basically said, I think there are women that were sitting there, they had breast cancer, and don't quote my numbers, but I believe they asked how many of you would want to be on a clinical trial. 80% of them said they would. How many of you were offered? Between 40 and 50% of them were offered a clinical trial. They were not getting offered the clinical trial because a lot of times people assume that they wouldn't want to because of all this stuff that we talk about, instead of giving them the opportunity. And the data are clear. When you bring the trials to the patients in their communities, they actually get on the trials, right? And the data is consistent with that. So I think a lot of times we need to stop underestimating even our desire to get on clinical trials and people of color and start offering it to them. So I think there are multiple factors as to why people don't get on clinical trials, but a lot of it now has to do with our own implicit biases as healthcare professionals.
Yeah, and can I just piggyback on it?
Yeah, I just want to add something there. I think the story of Tuskegee and quote unquote desire not to participate in clinical trials is overstated.
Yes.
In fact, I think it's become a boogeyman, and it's something I don't want to hear about anymore. And the reason why I say that is that if you look, so there are cooperative groups in oncology. If you look at SWOG clinical trials, for example, you see that they represent almost close to the populations that they serve compared to pharmaceutical industry trials. Why is that? The reason is that if you look at cooperative group trials that are done in the communities where the patients receive their care, the people who they trust, it's not that Black people or any other people, including rural people, do not trust doctors. It's that they trust their own doctors.
Yes.
If you allow the people from whom they receive their care, provide them clinical trials, they will participate. They trust those people implicitly. But typically what happens, pharmaceutical companies go to the same universities that they've gone to for years, irrespective of what their catchment is in terms of minority populations, rural populations. Number two, pharmaceutical companies or the teams that they work with do not have diversification of those teams. So it starts from the level of the steering committee of those clinical trials. Most of those steering committee members do not represent the population that is intended to be treated. And then you go down to the level of the clinical trial enrollment. Look at those research teams. You're not going to necessarily create a PI that looks like every patient, but your team of people who are helping you enroll, how many of your coordinators, how many of your navigators look like the patients that you're trying to enroll. You know, one of the things we learned from COVID is that the distrust of new drugs is not inherent to only to minority patients. It's so, yeah, I mean, you look at patients that you normally, even physicians that you thought would normally embrace clinical research, they all disagree with COVID. So I think the issue is really where those trials are placed, who's running the trials, the diversity of those teams, and we got to do better with that. And so these diversity action plans have to include such efforts. But like I said, we have to shame people who do not meet the goals that they intended or wrote into their diversity action plans. Otherwise, it's another piece of paper.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I know, Leslie, you want to say something after that? I want to jump in.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, for me, are you okay? Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I think there's a delay. No, I just wanted to second everything that you said, particularly Ivory, about education and awareness, and Dr. Small too. I also feel like a big, one other area is access that you mentioned, Dr. Small. The access is key, because I feel like you could have awareness, but if you don't have the access, it's a moot point, right? So it's really understanding too, and I agree so much about what's been said about just people tend to want to go to doctors, that look like them, right? Because I think we need to recognize that there are cultural differences, and not everyone has the same beliefs about healthcare or clinical trials or information about their health in the same ways. And we are not a monolithic people, right? We are so diverse in the ways that we think. So there are differences in the way we'd approach recruitment for different populations, even within, the Black African American community. I think, Dr. You mentioned COVID. COVID, I think, was a great example, right? I don't know about you guys, but I had friends who didn't want the vaccine, right? Because they didn't trust it. So again, this was just as soon as a couple of years ago, where people still had that bias and that still misunderstanding and miseducation. So I think, we first need to understand who our patients are and really design the recruitment and retention strategy around like the motivators and the barriers and the preferences of a certain population. Again, realizing that not one size fits all. And, working with caregivers and patients, like you said, and doctors, maybe naive physicians, having mentoring programs and listening, like lessons learned, and listening from the patient, right? Hearing what the patient is saying in their communities with their patient advocacy groups, really listening to them and holding like that level of empathy, like putting ourselves in their shoes, because that's what it boils down to, is like you're saying, the trust and all that thing is really recognizing what is relevant with different cultures. So our messaging really resonates with them. For example, for some recruitment materials might work better if they're personalized, for certain communities, or help people with color in their communities, then motivators for certain populations, referral programs, things that we can do like low-hanging fruit to really build empathy and perspective awareness with site staff through engaging with communities and collaborating with those patient advocacy groups. So I definitely think access is huge, because again, you can have the education, you can have the awareness, but if you don't have the access, Dr. Small mentioned, it's kind of a moot point. So I feel like that's an area where we could really hopefully, gain some insights and hearing about the patients and not dismissing them. Like you said, there's bias, right? People don't listen to it's sad, right? They'll say, well, oh, you're okay, you're fine. No, listen to the patient, listen to what they're saying, and really having that intentional planning. So I think you mentioned, Ivory, like, a lot of times sponsors like swoop into a community, get their patients, and swoop out. There's no foundational building of trust and education. So maybe you don't call me just about the trial. You're calling me to check in on how I'm doing and understanding what my needs are. So.
And could not agree more. And obviously, I'm loving the way this conversation is going, because a lot of times I'll go into meetings and people just sit on trust. They don't trust, and therefore, and that puts the challenge and the failure of inclusive research on the recipient, which is not fair, right? And so I'm so glad we're talking about like these are true barriers that results in lack of inclusive research, lack in diverse research, and the pieces that you guys have mentioned, especially I could not agree more. People trust their clinicians. And a lot of times these trials are not brought into the community, right? And we know a lot of times what about 80% of most patients live in the community, yet 80% of these studies are in academic centers, and they just won't get access to it. I can tell you one of the things we're pushing at my company is to turn that on its head and make sure we're going into the community to open up these trials, making sure that we're even helping up stand up infrastructure so that because here's the thing, you can throw a trial there, but if you don't have the infrastructure, and it takes a lot of work to get these trials going, but let's remember the reason why these other academic centers can do it is because they've been invested in. So now let's flip it on its head and invest in these community sites where the patients truly are. And that to me is the only way we're going to really open the floodgates and make sure that these patients that have the disease actually are on the trial.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear Dr. Small mention that, because we need to go where the patients are. Of course, yes, trusting their doctor is key. But many of these clinical trials, once we've done the education, the awareness, all that, they say, yes, I'm going to participate in this clinical trial. And now you're asking me to take off of work. You're asking me to pay for transportation somewhere, or pay for parking. I can't afford that. There's so many other barriers that many companies just don't think about when they're trying to recruit people for clinical trials. Maybe I have kids and babysitters, all these elements. So to be able to come into the community, to be able to partner with community centers and churches, and that way you also are then building that foundation of trust. If you're going into the community, you're building this bond. You're not just reaching out when it's time for a clinical trial, and then we do the clinical trial, we do all this, we never see you again. Right? You're now in the community, building that trust, building that community where people now trust you, and it is not costing them, an arm and a leg, because many times that is an arm and a leg for them to be able to have to pay for transportation, or they don't have opportunity to take off of work. I also think marketing is key. We worked with an organization, University of Baltimore, for a program once, and they said, oh, do you guys have any brochures on liver disease? We said, absolutely, we'll send it to you. And the lady said to me, but make sure that the brochures have people of color on them. Please don't send us brochures, because they will not take them. Yeah. And as a Black woman, I never even thought of that. I just did not think of that. I just thought we're going to send you some brochures, and if you have liver health or whatever you're interested in, you'll pick it up. But she said no. So again, you want to also look at the marketing that you're preparing for people. If it's something about clinical trials, make sure, spend the money to make sure that there are diverse people on the brochures, so that way people are interested and they already feel a level of openness for that.
Mm-hmm. I love that you're mentioning some of these, I guess, tips on how we can really get into the community and get them, get the community to kind of trust and feel more comfortable with, the clinical trial. Are there any other tips or any other advice on, how this can best be done?
Yes, there are a few things. One area is culturally sensitive training. That's something that we've been talking about, to make sure that, again, when I mentioned training the medical professionals or any of the community center workers, so that way they have the training that's culturally sensitive to be able to interact and engage with the community. Partnering with churches, partnering with HBCUs. If your goal is to really educate and get more Black people with clinical trials, again, you have to go to where they are, right? So to be able to partner with them, being able to not only hopefully be able to support them with transportation costs or going into the community, but maybe even, paying them to participate in the clinical trial, but also maybe paying them to participate in just coming out for a listening session or an educational element. So that way you are listening to what the community is saying. You're also educating them about what clinical trials are. You're not even getting to the point asking them to participate in the clinical trial. You're saying, listen, I'm going to pay you to just come out to learn about what clinical trials are. And so that way, if we get to that next stage, you're aware of it, you are understanding of that. I think there are a few elements that are just so key. I think that many advocacy organizations like myself can also partner with other organizations to come together to train and to educate. I think it's key. We are working with University of Pennsylvania on a PCORI grant that is talking with clinical trials in regards to liver disease. And it's a few of us on this committee, about 4 of us, and they're medical professionals, but we are being very specific on how we're targeting the community to participate in these clinical trials, how we are now paying for them to participate. We, like the doctor said, we're making sure that the people on the clinical trials look like the people that we're trying to recruit to participate, which I think is vital. And I think many people don't think about that area. And I think it's something that's vital.
Absolutely.
So just a few tips.
Only additional comment I'll add is that the word diversity has increasingly become politically charged. And so I think we need to begin to think of other language that is inclusive but meets the goal. And it's also very important that when we talk about diversity, that we don't always lead with race, because then people think that all we're really saying is black or white, when really we are talking about generalizability and of clinical research results to the people that we're going to treat. And in order to do that, we have to also remember that gender is very important. And we also have to think about that rural and urban divide. And some people have said, well, but if people are genetically the same, how can a rural and urban divide matter? My new hypothesis is that we do know that the microbiome of people are different, and particularly people in urban areas have different diets from people in rural areas. So their microbiomes are different, and we're beginning to understand just that microbiome and its effect on drug metabolism. And those things ultimately matter, and the only way you'll know is by studying them. So it's very important that we discuss diversity in a more inclusive manner so that no one feels scared or challenged by using the word diversity. So the new word that I've started using is clinical trial excellence.
I like that.
Yeah, I've been using. I agree with you so much. I've been using, especially I think with the updated FDA mandate, they've broadened the definition as well.
Yes.
And I've been using the word inclusive research specifically because of that, because you want the research or the studies that you're doing to be inclusive and actually represent the real world patients. And so I've been actually shying away a lot from diverse research because it's very narrowing. That you really want to make sure that that your studies include the patient population with the disease.
Yeah,
yes.
I agree with that so much. Both physicians, both doctors. I feel like, women, like you said, the guidance now does have a greater lens on women enrollment. And we know that women in particular, cardiovascular trials are, really, we are, unfortunately, women do that. But I also agree, that I like that inclusivity, because it is people with disabilities, right? What about that whole genre? I was approached about participation of some protocols who have exclusive language for the LGBTQ community when they talk about HIV, because that's like that standard exclusion criteria that's been there for centuries, right? That talks about HIV, and are we not including people in the LGBTQ community because of that factor? So you're absolutely right. Both you guys are wonderful about that, because it is not just. Because you're right. I do think people just focus on Black, white, or Hispanic, right?
Yes.
It's not women. It's not people with disabilities. What about our LGBT community? It's a lot, right? So I agree with you guys totally about that. It's so important.
And then another comment that I have is
try and use inclusive research. Definitely use that. One area that I wanted to mention is testimonials. I think testimonials are also probably something that is helpful and beneficial to be able to provide. So people are able to, oh, wow, this is such and such. So this was a great trial to participate in, and they felt comfortable and da-da-da-da. I think that helps others. I apologize. I think the doctor wanted to say something, but I just wanted to put that out there that I think that is key.
The other thing I wanted to say is, remember how we're talking about ex-US I just want to make a couple of comments. One is that it is true that in some places you cannot collect race data, but I was at a meeting recently, and one of the investigators was from Germany. And in fact, I'm working on an editorial for HIMSFAIR, which is a European language, a European hematology paper. And what I recommended is that in those settings, pharmaceutical companies should create a website that patients can be encouraged who are participating in clinical trial to self-report their race and ethnicity so that you don't have to necessarily use the usual structure. Patients can self-report. And I think you can overcome some of that ability to collect that data by have patients self-report to a website. And the second thing is that, it is true that you want to develop your clinical trials and you want your clinical trials to be to result in drug approval very quickly. But the United States still leads the world, and what we do in the US is going to lead the world. And it is very important that this work by the FDA is done, because what it will do is that it will force other agencies and potentially use that global harmonization project that they have to sort of force other agencies in the world to begin to require similar inclusivity in their research. Because in Europe, for example, when I was talking to this physician, he said, well, the issue might be more of East versus West. It may not necessarily be race as we think about it, but it might just be looking at Eastern Europe and Western Europe and the newly emerged countries from the Eastern Bloc, and those people don't been included in clinical trials.
Mhm. Thank you for that. I love that we talked about kind of updating our terminology. I know Dr. Bihure said clinical trial excellence, and Dr. Tanya, I believe you said research inclusivity.
Inclusive research, inclusive
Research.
research.
I
Yeah.
love that. I love that. So, are there any other strategies that we can use to increase diversity or finally achieve clinical trial excellence? Dr. Tanya, do you want to take on that one?
Sure. I mean, the way I typically think about these things are, and just because of the simplicity of my brain, in three buckets, right? It's in what's intrinsic to the study, what's intrinsic to the treater in the healthcare community, and practical solutions, right? So if you think about what's intrinsic to the study, and again, as you guys know, I work at BMS, and I have a history of doing drug development as well as medical affairs. And one of the things that we are doing at BMS, and I would say a lot in the healthcare system, is really looking at our eligibility starting there, again, inclusive to the study. I know, Leslie, you mentioned this, and this is one of the biggest challenges. When you pass, cut and paste eligibility criteria, you've already knocked out a lot of the population. So what we're trying to do, what we're doing at BMS, and what we're doing quite a bit, I think, in the industry, is re-looking at eligibility criteria. And a few examples are, when you look at lab, again, back to your point, Leslie, if you look at lab base, a lot of it was in terms of what we called baseline, a lot of it was based on white males. And that number, then you get women who can't get on. You have actually people of color who can't get on. If you look at white cell counts, Black people tend to have lower white cell counts. A lot of people I know actually said they got excluded from a trial just on that alone. If you look at testosterone level, you have, again, Black men have different baselines than white men. And this is just, right? So we're looking at just people getting excluded based on criteria. If you're thinking about HIV, to your point, if it's controlled, why can't you get on the trial? If you have diabetes, that is controlled. Why can't you get on the trial? So we're looking at criteria, resetting baselines, and saying, let's make sure the right people, again, get on the trial, and don't use prior history that we've had in trials to represent that. Other pieces, consent forms, languages, right? Consent forms, 50 pages long in one language, and half of it can't be understood. We're redoing our consent forms to make sure it's understandable, to make sure it's in multiple languages. When you look at monitoring, I think you spoke about this, Ivory. People don't wake up and realize they have a disease. They have a life they have to live. How can we expect these people to stop their life, to come on these clinical trials, get monitored every week, and do all these different things? So one of the things we're trying to do also at BMS is have flex schedules. So we actually have patients look at our protocol before we implement it. We see where we can flex the schedule so that you can do your day-to-day stuff and still be on the clinical trial. So things intrinsic to a study to me are huge. And I think people don't understand how many times these studies typically exclude people that should be coming on trials. The second piece is intrinsic, like I said, to the healthcare providers and that whole team. We spoke a little bit about that, about our own unconscious bias and not offering these patients the study with the assumption that they won't go on, or not being able to offer these patients the study because the treating physician doesn't have access. And then the last piece, like I said, are those like practical obstacles. How do you get there? Right. I know, Ivory, you spoke about transportation. I think a lot more studies are offering transportation, but we need to do a lot more than that. We need to, again, flip it on its head and go there, help build the infrastructure that's sustainable. Not just one trial, but that's sustainable. And I said, and I think I told you guys before, that's something we're doing. But I also see a lot of other institutions really investing in the community, because that's the only way we're going to be able to do that. Yeah. I think, again, working with the communities directly to get people to those centers, to educate them, to make sure that the treating physicians and the staff actually, whether they look like them, but if they don't, at least they understand their culture. They understand sometimes you need a family unit instead of one person to make a decision. Different cultures think differently. I think you said this before, we are not monolithic. Yeah. So making sure the right people are there who understand the population is imperative.
I think that's so key, Dr. Small. It is so funny. I'm smiling when you said just the one patient, but we had a study where it was the whole family came. It wasn't just, it was like grandma, the aunts, the uncles, the whole family came. And if one person wasn't feeling the study, they were like, we're not doing it. We're out of here. So you're so right that it's a cultural understanding. Like, you know, it's beautiful. It's so funny, it's whole family. But back to what Ivory was saying, you know, I think, and what you were saying, there's so many things we can do. Like, you know, we're talking about transportation. You know, would a center be willing to leave their center open an extra half an hour for the end of the day, right? Or 45 minutes, or have childcare opportunities. You know, someone's daughter can make $20 babysitting, putting them in the, you know, just little things you don't really think about. But I do agree with you about the informed consent forms. I think that is huge, because I've had studies where I've been working on trials where even within like the Spanish community, like South Florida, there are so many dialects of Spanish. Yes. There's not one Spanish. And I think it's intuitive to us to really, and I'm so wonderful to see as a sponsor, your organization is really taking the intentional planning and return of investment on that, because that's a challenge working with some sponsors. They don't see the importance. Well, we don't want to pay for an extra consent form. Well, you know, 6 months in, they say, oh, well, yeah, maybe we need an extra. Now it's too late, right? It's 4 months in the study. So I feel like, you know, because I talked to a physician in South Florida, he said, you know, we have Castilian Spanish, we have this kind of Spanish, we have multiple Spanish. And so it's not one dialect, and understanding what works best for those communities that both you guys and Ivory has said, pulling in those communities, like, you know, getting that information and really having informed decisions. Because like you said, we said at the beginning, people are going to trust their people that they know. Yes. And people that say, if you know, this is a great, if you're not going to say it's a good clinical trial to be on, I'm not going to do it. So I think there's some things that we can do, really, you know, holding sponsors more accountable to really do ROI. You know, they want to see ROI quickly, but understanding it takes time to build. And it is, you know, it might cost more, but your long-term benefit in building those relationships and having more informed consent forms, just little things, that low-hanging fruit we could do. So.
Yeah, trust is so important and is key. You know, when strangers, you know, come to you and they say, oh my gosh, you have to go to this hair salon. And they're like, hair salon, barbershop, oh my gosh, it's new in the community. And you're like, oh no, I don't know anything about that barbershop or hair salon. Mm-hmm. But maybe you will go once you've heard others that you trust have been there, right? I think we all know that hair salon or barbershop, you're not going to unless you know someone else and it's that trust. Now you're taking this a step further, it's people's health. You know, and participating in things like this. Again, it's that trust and building a community. You want to, what Dr. Small is doing with BMS, they are building relationships to be partners. We are partners within this with you. You know, we're not just coming here to take something from you and then use it for whatever. We're here to be a partner. We're in the community and we are joining forces with you, because I think, again, back to the education piece, understanding, and Dr. Small talked about this earlier, understanding the importance of clinical trials and how that will affect you, right? Many people aren't doing something to participate in something, sadly, just because it helps everyone, right? Oh, it helps everyone. Maybe I'll do it. But when they understand that the clinical trials eventually are the drugs that you're taking, oh, wait, these clinical trials are affecting people that potentially are in my family who are taking these drugs. Oh, I didn't think of that. I didn't understand that. These are small elements, and I say to people, we work with a lot of medical professionals, and we try to explain to them, people are not stupid. People understand as long as you take the time to be patient and explain something to them. And when you're talking about clinical trials and their health, if you just take the time to turn away from the computer screen and look at them and explain to them what's happening, and being, culturally sensitive and having different languages and being open to them, they will begin to open up and say, oh, okay, I get it. I understand. Oh, I see why this is so important. You know what? Let me take this information. That's not a book, is a page or two. Let me take it back to my family to discuss and see if this is something that, again, where Leslie was talking about, where we want to participate in, because it is, most of the time, it's a family unit where we are going to make this decision. It's not, oh, I'll talk to my family and see if we will participate in this. And I think medical professionals also, and anyone with the clinical trials, you want to push that element too. And again, when you are in the community and getting to know the people, you'll know what type of language hopefully to use, but to be able to use that language, because you realize many people, if you're participating in a clinical trial, they are going to need their families, right? They're going to need them. So you also want to, put that out there as well. I just think that is very, very important, to make sure people are understanding we are partners. When we educate our patients about being advocates, we say, you're the number one advocate in your life. You're the boss of this medical team, whoever it is. If you're dealing with liver cancer or anything else, you're the boss. You can fire any of them. You can go somewhere else, as long as however you feel. But to understand that they are partners in your healthcare. And that's the same with this.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that. Love that. Love that. And I love that you also talked about, and that was a great way to put it. If someone tells you to go to this hair salon and you don't know them from, anybody else, you're not really going to go there. And so just kind of hearing that from people that you have seen before, people that you have gotten your advice from, or your medical advice from, people who you are familiar with, they're better to receive that information. And so that kind of leads me into how we can encourage physicians, nurses, healthcare practitioners, pharmacists even, to encourage people to participate in clinical trials. What can they do? How can they have these conversations? Because these are the people that people are seeing, their primary care physician. They're the one that they're seeing regularly. So how do we encourage them to have those conversations? What should they say? And that's open up to the group. Sorry, I didn't say anyone's name. Open up to the group.
I think educating them, something that we have tried to do prior to COVID, and we're looking to do this again next year, are having lunch and learns with medical professionals. We're going to try to do them virtually, and educating them about the importance of sharing the information that they know. And we know medical professionals, they are busy. I say all the time, you're out there saving lives. I understand if you didn't respond to my email within 24 hours, but finding an opportunity where we can really educate them about ways that will work best for them to educate others about the clinical trials, right? And I phrase it like that because I always feel like, and I'm not a medical professional, any of the others can chime in, you don't want to tell medical professionals how to do their job or what they should be doing. As an advocacy organization, that is not our goal or our job. Our goal is to say, well, how would it be best for us to support you in supporting patients on clinical trials? What's the best way for you to provide the information? Because we know how busy you guys are. Would it be helpful for us to have a listening session? Would it be best for us to provide a one-page document that we can create for you guys to give to your patients? What's the best way for us to support and assist you? Because I think many medical professionals, I think they want to help their patients. I don't think they want to help their patients. They want their patients to get healthy and to be better. So I think many times maybe they're not even thinking about it. I think, they're so overwhelmed. The medical professionals over the last 5 years, they're so overwhelmed with so much. And, finding the best way to figure out how to support them and being able to provide those tools and that knowledge for them so that they're not feeling overwhelmed, even more overwhelmed, to then take a few minutes to educate about clinical trials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would second everything that you just said, Irie. I think it's just, really understanding the biggest motivators and obstacles for participation, because what one community might have an obstacle might be different than the other, right? And like you said, I think that was excellent. You mentioned you guys have a cultural sensitivity training and understanding like what those microaggressions are sometimes that, that I call those passive aggressive people that, like they say things, but it's like, So really, and just leveraging those insights to really recognize what's relevant with different cultures so that your messaging really resonates with them. And understanding what recruitment materials work better and understanding that they work better when they're personalized to that community. So I really like that cultural training piece, because I do feel that there are multiple microaggressions, oh, that person talks so well. Well, why wouldn't they talk well? It's like just small little, things like that, we can relate because we understand culturally. But I think it's just educating people and having empathy. I think it's really important to have empathy to what, you don't understand. I might not understand what it is to be a Hispanic man, but I have empathy to what maybe some of his concerns are, right? And not downplaying them and minimizing them, which unfortunately Dr. Small mentioned earlier, a lot of times that can happen, bias. So it's just educating those people that have that open mind and empathy to understanding, putting yourself in someone else's shoes.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, I don't have much to add because I completely agree. I mean, as physicians, we're in a service field. We are here to serve these patients, right? To your point, they are the drivers of their health, not us. We are here to serve them. And here's the thing, and it's taken the time to even understand your patient and your community. What do they even want out of this medicine? What do they want? And not imposing our own goals, our own processes, our own thought process, and our own outcomes onto a patient, but taking that time to say, what do you want? I mean, and coming from Hem/Onc, some of our medicines are harsh and they may not want that. They may want to go a different route, but respecting the human that you're there to serve. And so I think when we talk about partnering with patient advocates to make sure that we understand how to do that, right? Partnering with patient advocates and different groups to make sure that we have, I think you guys said, the right material. I cannot even emphasize enough how important it is to make sure the material that we use represents the patient that is there. You want to make sure they see themselves on all your, I guess you call it brochures or our treatment plans and all these different things. They are entitled. They are entitled to be represented into these pieces. So I think there's just so much that we can do. But I think, Leslie, you nailed it. Let's understand what their needs are. Let's understand how they want to receive information. And we adjust accordingly, because again, we're here to serve them, not the other way around.
Absolutely. Ladies, I have loved this conversation. I'm having a hard time accepting the fact that we are already at 57 minutes. But I mean, I wish we could stay on, but I would love for you all to leave us with your final thoughts, either on the FDA mandate draft guidance. Oh, and Dr. Bahiri is back as well. But yes, just final thoughts that you'd care to share. Let's start with Dr. Small.
Oh, sure. So, I mean, in terms of the FDA mandate, again, I can't underscore enough, this is critical. It's really important. It may not be the final step. It may not be all that we want, but it is the beginning of us pushing all the healthcare systems to make sure that our research is inclusive and holding us accountable. The next step is mandating to make sure that we don't, if it doesn't happen, then what? We have to have some kind of follow-up to make sure, whether it's, again, post-marketing commitment, whatever it is, to make sure that our trials really are inclusive. But I do think it is the first step. I'm glad to see people are talking about it. I'm glad to see people acting on it. Now we just need to enforce it.
Absolutely.
I guess if I was to add anything, for some reason I'm upside down. I'm not sure if the camera is showing me upside down.
There you go.
Okay, all right. Okay. I promise I wasn't laying down. The only thing I'm going to add is that one of the things that we've published on is that, and I still believe this very strongly, that every clinical study should be ranked for their clinical trial excellence. We develop a ranking score, and that ranking score should be public knowledge. It should be used by providers and by patients in deciding whether they want to receive a particular treatment. In other words, when there are one or two drugs doing the same thing in the marketplace, as a consumer and as a provider, I would choose the one with a better ranking in terms of the people who were enrolled in the clinical trial. I do believe that is one important way that you can change behavior. Otherwise, we're dealing with, I'm sorry, Leslie and anyone else who works for the industry. We're dealing with mega corporations, and there is only one thing that matters, which is the greenback. And unless the greenback is threatened, there will not be a change of behavior. I'm sorry, but that's just the truth.
Despite the fact that
These were supposed to be closing thoughts.
because human beings are behind these trials that we write. I think we all want to we want to make sure it's inclusive. I think what this does is enforce it.
Leslie, care to share closing thoughts?
Oh no, I trust me. I'm on board with everything you just said. I think it's really, it's the intentional planning, and it's changing the way people think, which is a harder mountain to climb. But I do think that it's really incumbent of sponsors and industry as well, just to understand that the FDA expects reviewers to submit these diversity action plans, as they've been doing increasingly, especially like in oncology. And submitting plans, I think, will remain advisable for sponsors heading into like their phase 3 trials. But I do think a broader message needs to be the educational component. And I think that if we can establish really solid foundational pathways for education, then hopefully we won't have. I love this discussion. I would love to be on this panel with you guys all the time. But hopefully in 5, 4, maybe even less years, we won't have to have this. Like, it won't be this unique, separate entity. Like, right? I think Ivory mentioned before, it's not a checkbox. It should be the intentional planning of your strategy, just like anything else that you do when you design a trial. So I'm hoping that in the future we will avoid. I'd love to have these more, but we won't need these, because we will have that messaging that resonates. So
absolutely. Hopefully we come back and we're telling success stories.
Mhm.
Ivory's got some from
Amen.
her organization. You guys have some from yours. Hopefully that's what we come back and do. That's what we're crossing.
Amen.
yeah.
And we'll sing at the table of brotherly love and sing Kumbaya together.
But it's also, I think, to your point, I think we spoke about so many practical solutions,
Yeah.
right? And how do we join forces together to implement them, right? Because a lot of times there's still a lot of talk, and I go to so many meetings where people have really good ideas. Let's hold hands. Let's say, what are the things we're going to tackle together, and let's make it happen. So the next meeting we come together on this panel, we can talk about what worked, and then where do we need to evolve and tweak, instead of what should we be doing.
Yeah, collaboration is so key. My final thoughts, I would say, speaking to the community and the individuals who are listening to us, is next time you go to your doctor's office, bring up clinical trials. You don't have to wait until they bring it up to you. Again, you are the boss of your own health. Bring it up to them and say, hey, I heard about this clinical trial, or can you tell me a little bit more about clinical trial? bring it up to them. Don't wait for them to have to bring it up to you. And another element is, go to any website or look into, of course, I'm here for Liver Foundation. So go to liverfoundation.org and look up clinical trials. And we have some information on just what clinical trials are and all of the information and fact sheets. And if you find anything on there that you think, oh, why don't you have this on here, or this would be key, let us know. I think all of us might feel, I'm going, way back, is help us help you, right? Help us help you with this, so if you see something that isn't on there or you think we need to have, and I think that's for all of us, even with your medical professionals, to say, hey, why aren't you posting about that clinical trial? I heard about that. I know a friend who participated in it. I think making sure you utilize your voice is so key in this process.
Absolutely. I love that you mentioned, you said it a couple of times throughout the conversation, you are the boss of your own health. And while there are a lot of things that we can't control, if you're viewing, now you know. So you can bring these things up. You can talk to your doctor. And so if there are things that you are in control of, take control. Spark the conversation. Dr. Bihura, any last thoughts? I know you jumped in on everybody's final thoughts. Any last thoughts?
Okay, but two major thing I want to really bring up is there was a terminology that's been used, and I don't think we emphasize it enough. And I think that was Leslie that used it a lot of the times, which is intentional. Intentionality. That is a key word. And the reason why I bring that up is that I was talking to a colleague of mine who recently presented a study. And this particular study was actually a study in Hodgkin's lymphoma. And a drug was added to the backbone of chemotherapies, an immunotherapy drug. And in that study, they were able to enroll a quarter of the patients were Hispanics or Blacks. That was really unheard of in that space. And so the investigator, the PI for that study, I asked him, how did you get there? And he said it was intentionality. So we all have expressed our intentions here of what we want to do. Intentionality is the key to success, but you have to have that intention first before you can be successful.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for tuning in. If you are looking for more information on clinical trials, Ivory has actually shared a resource from her organization, but blackdoctor.org also has a clinical trials resource center as well, where you can find tons of information on clinical trials specifically created for our community to learn more. We also have a clinical trials search tool as well. So if you're looking for a clinical trial, you can find one there. Again, I want to thank my panelists for joining me today. This was an incredible conversation and fun, actually, at that. Usually clinical trials wasn't this fun, but we had some laughs in there, and I love that. So again, thank you all so much for joining me, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next time.